Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us. We're here today to announce action that we're taking on how to make our criminal justice system more equitable for people of color. Before I go into that, though, I wanted to share a short COVID-19 update. As of today, we have 37,160 lab-confirmed cases, 676 new cases reported today, 774 people in the hospital, which is yet another daily high on that statistic, and sadly, 1,029 people who've died. We continue to watch the state's numbers of infection and hospitalization, and we remain concerned that the numbers are increasing. And we'll be glad to address questions from the media about the pandemic during the question and answer period of this press briefing. But last week, we talked about how COVID-19 is shining a bright light on long-standing racial inequities in everything from healthcare to housing. The protests reignited by the murder of George Floyd are shining yet another light on inequities in our criminal justice system. George Floyd was not the first victim of excessive force. Too many other people of color have been harassed, harmed, injured, or killed. Added together, their lives and their stories have made this spotlight too bright to ignore. For Black people, the past several weeks have again ripped open scars created by generations of historical trauma. Too often, that trauma was inflicted by a criminal justice system that should protect them, but instead treats them unfairly. Data shows that nationwide, communities of color are disproportionately affected at all stages of the criminal justice system. Black adults are almost 6 times more likely to be incarcerated than white adults, and Black men are 2.5 times more likely to be killed by law enforcement. Hispanic adults are 3 times more likely to be incarcerated than white adults. When convicted of the same crime, Black men receive a prison sentence that is 20% longer than white men. Black women are in prison at twice the rate as white women and are 1.5 times more likely to be killed by law enforcement. These numbers are stark, and they tell a story that Black Americans have been living and telling us every day, even when there is no spotlight. It's important for us to recognize these telling numbers and identify the disparities, but it's even more important and challenging to actually do something about it. Today I signed Executive Order number 145 to establish the North Carolina Task Force for Racial Equity and Criminal Justice. It will be led by North Carolina Supreme Court Associate Justice Anita Earls and Attorney General Josh Stein. This task force is charged with developing and helping to implement evidence-based strategies and policy solutions to help eliminate systemic racism in our criminal justice system. They'll convene a wide range of stakeholders, including community policing advocates, state and local law enforcement agencies, people who have gone through and been affected by the justice system, representatives of the judicial branch, people from marginalized populations, and more. Their work will examine law enforcement and criminal justice practices, make concrete recommendations for how to make real improvements, and then submit a report to me by December the 1st. Now, I know a lot of the issues the task force will tackle have been researched and studied. But part of the job of the task force will be tailoring these ideas to North Carolina and developing a strategy on how to get these proposals implemented. The task force is just the beginning, and I'm committed to making sure we see real progress. Taking on issues of race and discrimination is often difficult and uncomfortable. Truth can be hard. That's why we need everyone, local governments, police departments, sheriffs, judges, prosecutors, civil rights leaders, legislators, and community members to weigh in and be committed to real change. To begin taking action in state government, our Secretary of the Department of Public Safety, Eric Hooks, has directed all state law enforcement agencies under the department to ensure they have a clear duty to intervene policy. That means if they see a fellow officer doing wrong, they must step in. He's also directed these agencies to review their existing policies. Those include arrest procedures, what kind of interactions require the use of force, and more importantly, which don't. How to prioritize de-escalation so they calm a situation rather than accelerate it. This review, along with recommendations of the task force, can determine changes that need to be made to ensure that our state law enforcement agencies are providing equitable, high-quality service while prioritizing the safety of all North Carolinas. And it's critical that our state law enforcement be leaders in repairing this breach. Law enforcement officers have a tough job, and I'm grateful for so many of them who are doing their best to protect and serve with fairness. Many of them now are telling me and recognizing and acknowledging that systemic and cultural changes must be made. They know that for our law enforcement and criminal justice systems to work, people have to have faith and trust in them. And they realize that. Right now, too many do not. And I'm hearing the same things from people who work in our court system who know that changes must be made there as well. As we listen to the cries of our fellow North Carolinians and work to better know their pain, we have to work better to rebuild systems that better strive to eliminate racism and bias. This will not be easy. It'll require listening to some hard truths to better understand each other and a commitment to work together in good faith. I pledge all of these things and look forward to work with this task force and getting things done. Today we have North Carolina Supreme Court Associate Justice Anita Earls and Attorney General Josh Stein, who are here with me today to say a few words. They will lead this important task force. All right, and we'll now recognize Justice Earls.
Thank you, Governor. Good afternoon. Last Tuesday, Chief Justice Sherry Beasley held a press conference to talk about how justice intersects with the protests that are occurring around the state. She acknowledged that racial disparities continue in our court system and in our criminal justice system. And she also called upon us to develop a plan for accountability in our courts. Today, on the day that George Floyd is being laid to rest next to his mother, I am glad to be joining with Attorney General Stein to launch an effort to help make true the Chief Justice's promise that we will do better. I'm grateful to Governor Cooper for his courageous leadership and for giving us this opportunity. We must change how the criminal justice system operates and without delay. We must eliminate the glaring racial disparities that continue to exist, and we must begin to live up to our most highly cherished value of equal justice under the law. After all, we're the state that espouses the creed to be rather than to seem. A recent poll found that 88% of Americans favor training police officers to de-escalate and avoid using force. 87% favor body cameras for all officers. 80% favor implementing an early warning system to identify problematic officers. And 67% favor barring the use of chokeholds. Americans favor change. But whatever the opinion polls might show, I bring an additional perspective. As a black woman whose husband, who is also black, was once approached by police with their guns drawn as he was sitting in his car, stopped by the side of the road and talking to me on his cell phone. I come to this work as a lawyer who has represented families of victims of police shootings and other excessive use of force in the 1990s, before there were cell phones with video cameras. And I come to this as a lawyer who has represented Black and Latino police officers in employment discrimination cases. Now, as a member of the judiciary, I am charged with upholding your constitutional rights, whether doing so is popular or not. I know that real change is long overdue and must come now. Our state courts are an integral part of the criminal justice system. Any effective effort to address racism in that system must include what happens in the courts. Certainly in a democracy, it is true that the people are more powerful than the people in power. I ask you to help us ensure that this task force makes sound recommendations for meaningful and lasting institutional change in order to achieve racial equity in North Carolina's criminal justice system. Thank you.
Thank you, Justice Earls. And now we'll hear from North Carolina Attorney General Josh Stein.
Thank you, Governor Cooper, for your leadership. It is an honor to join you today and to be tasked with co-leading this important group with Justice Anita Earls, whom I deeply respect. The inequities that African Americans experience, whether it's in the economy, health care, our schools, or the criminal justice system, are pervasive, just as they are wrong. Even today, African Americans are suffering death at greatly disproportionate rates from COVID-19. My heart aches for the families of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and so many other people who have been killed or mistreated by their own government. Any senseless act of violence is tragic, but especially so when perpetrated by those sworn to protect and defend us. It represents such a fundamental violation of the authority we grant law enforcement and the trust we place in them. It also undermines the important and hard work of the many peace officers serving our communities with dedication and compassion. Our United States Supreme Court building has the following words chiseled on its face: equal justice under law. Sadly, we remain in pursuit of this ideal. Last week, Chief Justice Sherry Beasley powerfully described some of the many shortcomings in our criminal justice system. She observed, in our courts, African Americans are more harshly treated, more severely punished, and more likely to be presumed guilty. I will add, in our communities, African Americans are more likely to be pulled over by police and more likely to die at their hands. None of this is acceptable. We have to make North Carolina a safe place for every person, no matter who you are. The Task Force for Racial Equity and Criminal Justice will consider and implement measures that can bring about meaningful change to the criminal justice system. We will review law enforcement recruitment, training, and accountability, as well as court issues, including pretrial release and the use of fines and fees. We will identify ways to build genuine trust between law enforcement and the communities they serve and protect. This is absolutely necessary today, just as it was in 1829 when Sir Robert Peel, the founder of modern policing, wrote, "The power of the police to fulfill their functions and duties is dependent on public approval of their existence, actions, and behavior, and on their ability to secure and maintain public respect." North Carolina has a tragic legacy of slavery, segregation, and racist violence that still affects our state to this day. But we have another inspiring legacy: the 1960 sit-ins in Greensboro and the hundreds of protests since, a state NAACP that filed more integration lawsuits than any other, a demonstrated willingness to adopt criminal justice reforms, and so much more. I truly believe our state can be a leader in identifying and overcoming systemic racism in our criminal justice system. And I am genuinely hopeful that this time is different. The protests have been more widespread, more persistent, and more diverse. Allies of all races are joining with Black people to say no more. This movement is generating energy that you can feel, and this task force must ensure that this energy is harnessed into meaningful and lasting change to help us heal, because Black lives matter. Thank you.
Thank you, General Stein. We also have with us today our Director of Emergency Management, Mike Sprayberry, our Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services, Dr. Mandy Cohen, our Secretary of the Department of Public Safety, Eric Hooks, and they are all available for questions, as are the three of us up here on the platform. We'll now open for questions, and if you can identify yourself and your organization, I would appreciate it. Thank you.
Our first question will be from Jason DeBruin with North Carolina Public Radio.
Hi, good afternoon. This is Jason DeBruin, North Carolina Public Radio. I'm not sure exactly who to direct this question towards, but we've seen a lot about use of force reports over the past couple weeks, and yet many of those remain hidden from public inspection. So sort of a two-part question. Do you think that these use of force reports should be a public record? And if so, what can you do to make them a public record, not only for statewide agencies, but even for local police and sheriff offices?
This task force is going to tackle all of those issues, and I think transparency will be at the very core of what they want to do. In order for people to be able to have trust in the system, then they have to know how it operates and what's going on. So one of the charges to this task force is the issue of transparency, and we look forward to pulling law enforcement and all of the other people in the task force together to talk about those issues and how they can best be put forward in order to be able to bring that trust and confidence to the system. Next question, please.
Our next question is from Brian Anderson with the Associated Press.
Hi, Governor. Thank you for the time and accessibility. I have two questions for you, but I can assure you neither of them are about the RNC. My first question has to do with President Trump saying he's looking to resume political rallies. Will you allow those events to take place if the number of attendees surpasses a certain threshold? And if so, what's that threshold? But secondly, related to COVID, I spoke with a farm worker advocate today who says there's no statewide strategy to ensure the safety of this largely Latino community during this pandemic. And she cites the state having a lot of general guidelines, but not as many enforceable requirements. So I just wanted to ask, what's your plan to keep Latinos and African-American workers in the food industry safer during this crisis with enforceable actions that ensure employers aren't compromising worker health? Thanks.
Thanks. As to the first question, we remain concerned about mass gatherings. It's one of the integral ways that COVID-19 is spread from one person to the next. And it's one of the reasons why we have kept our mass gathering prohibitions in place to reduce the amount of these gatherings across North Carolina. We're going to be moving into other phases, which might increase the mass gathering ban or might even eliminate the mass gathering ban. So we don't know when any of these rallies will occur. We talk to any organizer of events like concerts, sporting events, NASCAR races, others, about how these kinds of events can be held safely. And if there is some rally that is scheduled for North Carolina, we'll be glad to talk to that entity and try to figure out a safe way to have it in North Carolina. But you can be sure that the health and safety of North Carolinians is going to be the #1 priority in making that kind of decision. Secondly, we are deeply concerned about our Latinx community and how it has been disproportionately affected with COVID-19 infections. Right now, we are working to have testing sites put in areas where marginalized communities are so that they have more access to testing. We've hired contact tracers who can help to isolate people and stop the disease from spreading. And I think 34% of those new hires are bilingual, which is important to do. Our Department of Health and Human Services has worked closely with meat processing plants in working to protect their employees. But I want to call on Dr. Cohen to come forward. We have put together a disparities task force. This is one of the issues that they're going to address, but I know Dr. Cohen's team is implementing other changes as well.
Well, thank you, Governor, and thank you for the question, and want to agree with the advocate who you spoke with about the importance of focusing on some of our historically marginalized populations, our Latinx communities, our African American communities. It's incredibly important that we make sure that we are matching our response to what we are seeing in the data. And not only all of the things that the governor mentioned in terms of how we're working on testing and tracing, but we want to get want to be focused on those preventative measures as well. As you know, many businesses that they have resumed, there are requirements for those businesses, and we look forward to additional stakeholder feedback and work with our public health team on what are those additional actions that we continue to step up to make sure that we're protecting everyone in the state. And again, I want to remind folks that as we have more viral spread in our communities, it's more important than ever that each of us takes individual action to slow the spread of the virus. While we're seeing a disproportionate impact in some of our historically marginalized communities, it's because they work in jobs that have them have more exposure. They work in our grocery stores, they work in our long-term care facilities, and it is all of the additional viral spread that ultimately gets to that level of exposure for these populations. So while we are targeting additional response activities and additional prevention, it is really all of these broader efforts around prevention and those individual actions, whether it's doing your 3 Ws or having all of our businesses comply with the restrictions and the recommendations. All of those things matter and add up together to help us keep the virus level low and protect each other. Thank you.
Thank you. Next question, please.
Our next question is from Reuben Jones with Spectrum News.
Yeah, good afternoon, Governor. Wondering if you were tested for COVID-19 this afternoon and when you expect those results. And secondly, wondering if the state has looked at setting up any specific testing sites for protesters, as we've seen in New York, for example, where Governor Cuomo has set up about 15 protester-specific testing sites. Thank you.
We have advised anyone who has been in a crowd, and that would include protesters, to go get tested for COVID-19. You can be asymptomatic and you could have it and could take it home, can hurt your family or people that you know. So we're asking people to do that. We have a website where we have over 400 sites now where people can go to get tested. And we also have an app that you can download that if you do have some symptoms that you can put in to see whether you should get tested. But we're saying that if you've been in a crowd that you ought to. I briefly went out and greeted some protesters the other day in front of the executive mansion. So doing what I say, I'm going to get tested this afternoon, and we'll let the public know the results when they come in. I have no symptoms of COVID-19 and don't expect to be positive, but since I was out there, I think it's important that I do have the test, which I'm going to do today. Do you have anything to add to that, Dr. Cohen? Okay, thanks. Next question, please.
Our next question is from Kate Martin with Carolina Public Press.
Good afternoon, Governor. This is Kate Martin with Carolina Public Press. As you mentioned at the beginning of the press conference, you said there have been a lot of task forces about law enforcement and accountability You say that transparency is very important, and I think Jason DeBruyn asked a really good question about these use of force reports, and right now they are hidden from public inspection, and he asked a question about whether you think they should be public in North Carolina. I'm hoping you could specifically address that question. Thank you.
Well, thanks. Those kinds of issues are the issues that this task force will tackle. And one of the things that is important about the task force is that we're going to put people together who can get these things implemented. And when you're talking about changes like that, you're talking about potentially changes in the North Carolina General Assembly. There may be degrees of disclosure that you would want to get into. So I believe that transparency is important. I also know that trust and confidence in our court system and law enforcement is important, and we're going to work with that in mind when this task force is created and the work is undertaken. Next question, please.
Our next question is from Rose Hoban with North Carolina Health News.
I also know that.
Good afternoon, Governor. This is a question for both you and for Dr. Cohen. We've heard from some readers who are defined as essential workers, like folks who work in stores and whatnot, and they're wondering if there's going to be a continuation of the child care subsidies that have helped them to go to work since their kids are not in school.
Thanks. I'm going to let Dr. Cohen take that one.
Hi, Rose. Thanks for the question. And I know that the pot of money was for a limited period of time, so let us follow up exactly on the parameters of that. So we'll follow up right after this. Sorry about that. Thanks.
That has been an important benefit for our frontline workers. And we're also very grateful to the child care providers who have stepped up through all of this at risk to themselves to provide this desperately needed service for us, particularly during this time of the pandemic. We're always grateful for our early childhood educators, and we need to do more for them to attract and retain them into the system. But we're particularly grateful during this very stressful and difficult time for everybody. Next question, please.
Our next question is from Dawn Vaughn with the News and Observer.
Hi, Dawn Vaughn with the NNO. Thanks for taking my questions. One, I was following up on a question one of my colleagues sent to your office earlier today about why enforce the executive order with the ACE Speedway and not with other racetracks that are operating with fans. And then about the matter today, Black Lives Matter movement has been around for a while. Why is now the time for the task force and then also directing DPS to review policies, and what will be the accountability for that?
Well, thanks. As to the first question, we're not specifically aware of other speedways that are in operation. Maybe Dr. Cohen, her office does, but I'm not specifically aware of them. This particular speedway knows that the order is in existence and has flagrantly violated the order and put their customers in danger, as well as anybody who comes in contact with their customers. And today, the Department of Health and Human Services has issued an order that I'll let Dr. Cohen tell about you. I think most all of us have sensed a real defining moment here with the death of George Floyd on film from start to finish, no question what has happened. And I think that people have reached a tipping point here that I think is positive. I think we've made some integral progress as we've gone along on this. But I think this is a real defining moment, not only for our state, but for the entire country. And I hope that we can capture this moment, bring the parties together, figure out the ways that we can prioritize the changes that need to be made, and then most importantly, how can we establish the coalitions to actually get it done? Because that's going to be involving changing law enforcement agencies all across North Carolina. And the conversations that I've had with some leaders in law enforcement say that this is a time for real self-reflection self-examination across the board, starting with state law enforcement agencies, and our Secretary Eric Hooks has sent a letter to state law enforcement agencies today outlining things that need to be done. And so we believe that this is an integral part of what we're going to be doing going forward to try to get rid of the systemic racism and the disproportionate disparities that we see in all of these facts and figures right on paper. It's been on paper, now it's on video for all to see. Now it's time for us to get to work. I'll let Dr. Cohen address the other issue.
Thank you. Regarding Ace Speedway, I think as you just take a step back, I think you know that the state partnered, for example, with NASCAR, where they were able to put together a very detailed protocol on how to run the Coca-Cola 600, and they had a very good event. They didn't have spectators. They protected the drivers and other staff that were there, and so that we are wanting to work with folks to find ways to run some of these activities. And I would say a lot of the other short track raceways around the state have worked with us. For Ace Speedway, they've continually, despite the fact that we have reached out and they know about the order and asked them to come into compliance, we sent letters ahead of time asking them to come into compliance, and still, they did not work with us on that. So we felt like we needed to take this action because mass gatherings do spread the virus, and it was irresponsible for them to keep operating in the way they were doing with thousands of people shoulder to shoulder, no face coverings, and so we want to take this action to make sure folks know that we need to take this seriously, particularly in a week when we are seeing our trends go in the wrong direction. I'm very concerned about that, and I think we need to make sure that we each are doing our part, individual and business, to protect each other here in North Carolina. Thank you.
Thank you. Next question, please.
Our next question is from Lisa Lano with Fox 8 WGHP.
Good afternoon. Will your cabinet be considering similar action against other racetracks? Will you be investigating reports of other racetracks having large crowds? And the second question is if you would differentiate, why is attendance at large rallies with little to no social distancing allowed, but gatherings at races not allowed?
Well, first, our first choice is local law enforcement, which has a duty to enforce these executive orders. And most places across the state, everybody wants to work together and are abiding by the orders. Law enforcement, when they see a violation, are telling people about it, and a lot of people are correcting the violation. So in the vast majority of places across this state, this is working well. In those places where they may be racing and they may be mass gatherings in excess of 25 people outside, which would trigger the order, we would hope that local law enforcement would have that conversation, and if they continue to do it, that law enforcement would take action. If in these places that same thing happens and the Department of Health and Human Services determines that this is a real problem, then we would take action just like we have with Ace Speedway. We are concerned about people who are at protests and are concerned about potential COVID spread, and so you hear us talking about it. Those protests have First Amendment protections, just like the Reopen NC protests that occurred in Raleigh. These protests deserve the same constitutional protection, but it doesn't mean that people shouldn't take steps to protect themselves and others from COVID-19. And there have been a lot of rallies where people are wearing masks and people are trying to stay apart from others and are using hand sanitizer and are washing hands. And it's a good thing. Also, they're outside. But we want people to go get tested if they have been to them. Thank you. Next question.
Our next question is from Bill McGinty with WCNC.
Hey, Governor. Bill McGinty from WCNC here in Charlotte. Thanks for taking the question. My question has to do with unemployment. We got a release the other day, I believe it was last Friday, that less than 57,000 people are still waiting for unemployment checks on the first-time basis. What can you say about the unemployment process to the people that are still struggling to get through the system and to get their payments?
Some significant strides have been made. There's a chat function. They're answering the calls. They're helping tell people where their claim is in the process. I haven't looked at the numbers today, but it's close to 700,000 North Carolinians who are receiving unemployment benefits. There are close to 300,000 people who applied but did not qualify for benefits under the law, and it's something that North Carolina needs to look at. We have some of the most draconian unemployment laws in the country. I made it better with my executive order, but there's still several hundred thousand people, at least tens of thousands. I'll get you the exact number of people who did not qualify. But there still are thousands of people who are in the system. Some of their claims are more complicated. They are working through this process to make sure that every single person who qualifies for benefits gets them. They're making significant progress, and they need to keep working until every single claim has been adjudicated and every single family that deserves to get unemployment benefits get them. Thanks. Next question, please.
Our next question is from Dewan Hogard with ABC 11.
Hi, good afternoon, Governor. Dewan Hogard here with ABC 11. This is going to be a question for you or the Attorney General or Justice Earls. Specifically with this task force, how would they be able to address some of the existing Supreme Court case law that does protect officers, such as Terry versus Ohio, Pennsylvania versus Mims, or Tennessee versus Garner?
Well, first, I think any of the work of the task force would consider the Constitution and would not want to propose something that would be unconstitutional. But that doesn't mean that they aren't going to propose things that would change our laws. And I think that will happen and should happen. There's some things that need to change. And I'll let both of them to address this. Justice Earls or Attorney General?
I endorse exactly what the governor said. Obviously, we have to respect the Constitution and any idea that's considered. There are many good ideas out there. The issue isn't, are the ideas existent? The issue is, which ones make the most sense for North Carolina today? And that's what our task force is going to do. We're going to process all of these ideas and prioritize them for local governments and the state government. And we welcome the ideas of you, the people of North Carolina. We will have a portal created whereby you can submit your ideas for our consideration because we know that there are good ideas all throughout this state.
I would just add, thank you for that question. On the issue of legal doctrine, many of the precedents you mentioned, I think, can, in some regards, be addressed through legislation, and I think it is within the purview of the task force to examine those and make recommendations in those regards. So definitely we want to hear from the public about what they see as the biggest barriers. Thank you.
Thank you. Next question, please.
Our final question today will be from Tyler Dukes with WRAL.
Hi, Governor. I just want to follow up on Don Vaughn's question. So you were Attorney General for 16 years, and now that you're Governor, you're taking on this issue of equity and criminal justice. Why wasn't equity and criminal justice an issue that you tackled during your tenure as head of DOJ?
Well, I did, and in fact, led the effort to establish open file discovery, which helped criminal defendants get a fairer trial in court, work with community policing and helped to establish that along with police accountability, helped fix the problems in the state crime lab to make things fairer for people in the entire court system. And this is a continuation of that effort to work for justice and fairness. And I look forward to this task force continuing those efforts to bring a new day to North Carolina, which I believe that all of us coming together we can do. Thank you all for being with us today, and look forward to being with you again soon this week. Thank you.